Because the women companions went to the mothers of the believers. And the mothers of the believers have a set of verses that explicitly talk about them, that are addressed to them. And so other women who are not the mothers, they came to the mothers of the believers and they said, it's not fair that you have verses just for you, and that we don't have verses that are for us. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed this verse. Ibn Ashur, who is a commentator of the Quran, talks about the fact that this ayah explicitly says the Muslim believing man, the believing woman, and mentions all these characteristics, that they are patient, that they are obedient to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that they give in sadaqah, that they're charitable, that they protect their chastity, all of these beautiful qualities. But are there not other verses of the Quran that talk about believers? Oh, believers fast. Oh, believers give in charity. Aren't women part of the believers? So Ibn Ashur mentions that the Quran was already for men and women. But they are used to a society in which women are not always included. And also, in the time period previously to the Jewish nation, the default was that the rulings were for men, and there were some things mentioned for women. So the Quran as a whole is changing the narrative that some people might be used to. That the entire book is for all of you. And it's an affirmation that even though the rest of the book is for you, and that women are included in everything too, that you're also explicitly mentioned. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala revealed Quran when women had questions. Like when a woman came to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and she was in so much emotional distress because of a circumstance that happened with her husband. And she's whispering to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And what did he respond? You recite it with me. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. قَدْ سَمِعَ اللَّهُ قَوْلَ الَّتِي تُجَادِلُكَ فِي زَوْجِهَا وَتَشْتَكِي إِلَى اللَّهِ وَاللَّهُ يَسْمَعُ تَحَاوُرَكُمَا إِنَّ اللَّهَ سَمِيعٌ بَصِيرٌ. Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala hears her, that she's coming and arguing with the Prophet asking, hurting, complaining, hopeful. And that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is what? Sami' and Basir. That He is all hearing and He's all watchful. He's always able to see. He knows what you are going through. We have Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala recording the voices of women over and over in the Quran in so many instances. And in one of the most painful, when Asya alayhi salam, when she was in the midst of martyrdom, and what is the dua that she makes? Tell me. رَبِّ ابْنِ لِي عِندَكَ بَيْتًا فِي الْجَنَّةِ وَنَجِّنِي مِنَ الْقَوْمِ الظَّالِمِينَ. That she is asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to bless me with having a home next to you, Ya Allah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala recorded these voices of women over and over. He sent revelation in response to women's voices who had questions, and He affirmed women's decisions and their intellect. Like when the Queen Saba, when she's talking to her advisors, there's a point of the verse where she's saying something, and then she says, وَكَذَلِكَ يَفْعَلُونَ. And that is what they do. But she just explained what they do. So would it make sense for me to be like, did you know, sister, that they do this, that's what they do? It is an affirmation, it is an emphasis, but some of the scholars of tafsir say Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was affirming her intellect. That He is affirming her words Himself. The Quran has preserved women's voices throughout centuries. And that history of connecting to the Quran is something that we see in the role of the women companions, radiyallahu anhum. So for example, one time the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, as mentioned in Musnad Imam Ahmad, he was walking past a house, and there was a woman who was reciting inside, and her voice carried out because the homes back then were not in these insulated homes. And so she says, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, هَلْ أَتَاكَ حَدِيثُ الْغَاشِيَةِ. Has the news come to you? Who is you? The Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam responds, and he's very emotional, and he says, it's come to me, it's come to me. We have Asma radiallahu anha, the daughter of Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu. And she would stand and recite over and over and over one ayah. She would just keep reciting, فَمَنَّ اللَّهُ عَلَيْنَا وَوَقَانَا عَذَابَ السَّمُومِ. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us such a blessing that He's protected us from the fire, He's protected us from the punishment. And she would recite this verse one time, and then recite it another time, and recite it a different way another time. We have a narration of the Prophet ﷺ saying, let's go visit the martyr. Who's the martyr? She's alive, so why is she a martyr? They would go visit the martyr. Now, this is Waraqa radiallahu anha. This is mentioned by Ibn Hajar. Umar radiallahu anhu was her neighbor, and he would hear the Quran being recited through the walls. And one day he didn't hear her recitation. So he went to check on her, and he found she had been murdered. The martyr. The Prophet ﷺ used to call her the martyr, and she became a martyr. We have Ayman radiallahu anha. And when the Prophet ﷺ passed away, Umar and Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu said, let's go visit Ayman, and the Prophet ﷺ used to visit her. And when they went to visit her, she saw them and she started to cry. And they said to her, don't you know that what is with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is better for the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam? And she responded, I'm not crying because I don't know that what is with Allah is not better for the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. I'm crying because revelation has been cut off. And then they all began to cry. Hisham bint al-Haritha radiallahu anha, she has different narrations of how she memorized Surah Qaf. That she would hear the Prophet ﷺ recite it in Salatul Fajr, and she would pray behind him ﷺ, and so she memorized it because she heard it so much from him ﷺ, that she would sit at the sermon of Jum'ah, and near the khutbah, the Prophet ﷺ would recite it. And so she says, different narrations, but one of them is so cute. She says, I took Surah Qaf from the mouth of the Prophet ﷺ. These are people who interacted with the Quran. And they left a legacy of women interacting with the Quran. Women's voices have been written by the angels who are roaming the earth. Names, most of whom we don't have recorded, but we do have some of them. We have the narration of Imam al-Sakhawi, who mentions how emotionally affected he was by hearing Al-Qari'ah's recitation. We have in 444 Hijrah, in the city of Almira in Spain, there was a famed qari'ah. Her name was Rayhana, and she was known to be a scholar of the Quran. She got her multiple qira'at ijaza from a scholar of the Quran of their city. And she was a famed scholar of their city, of the Quran. And we have, subhanAllah, the Ottoman Empire, in the time of Ali Pasha, his court-appointed reciter was Sheikha Muhammad. And when she passed away, she was buried next to Imam al-Shafi'i. Rahmatullah alayhim. We have the Quran radio of Cairo. If anyone of you are from Egypt or have visited Egypt, Radio Quran, the channel of the Quran is huge in Cairo. And in the early 1900s, there were women that were Quran reciters on that channel. And I want you to think about something very fascinating. Who would you say is the most famous Quran reciter of all history? Tell me. Number one. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala raise his ranks. Tabarakallah. Do you ever think about how much reward he's receiving? Do you ever just sit there like completely astounded, like how? Like billions of people have probably memorized the Quran, or inshallah will, through this one person's voice. And Allah chose for this person to be born at a time when they were just having the tools available to be able to record. So if Abdul Basit has a specific style, you have style, right? Abdul Basit has a style. It's the Abdul Basit style. But if you listen to the woman on the radio from the 1920s, 1930s, which you can listen to on Figh, the Women Quran Reciters app, it is a free app. You can download it on Google Play or Apple stores. Mashallah, we have 5 million recitations being played globally. And thank you all for any of you who listen to it, for the amazing team, mashallah, Yasmin and her daughters who are here, mashallah, who helped edit it, tabarakallah. Mashallah, may Allah bless all of them. But these, mashallah, these women, if you listen, 1920s, we have a recitation from 1910. Her style is Abdul Basit. In the 1920s, 1930s, Abdul Basit was about 10 years old. So these women are adults who are reciting before he is a full reciter. So is it Abdul Basit's style? Or is it the style of women that Abdul Basit learned from? And Abdul Basit, I pray he receives may Allah bless him and honor us with being like him, every single reward that has ever come across from words, Ameen. But how many women was he taught by, affected by, whether it was his own mother, or any family member, or Quran teacher he heard on the radio, or at any point? How many women are also getting the reward of being his teacher? How many of you are getting the reward, inshallah, of the people that you are teaching because of your adab of Quran with your children? Because of your adab of Quran with your neighbors? Most of us will never be remembered. We're not going to be Abdul Basit. Inshallah, we will all be Ameen Ya Rab. But realistically, I should have said but right after Ameen. Ameen! And the angels record you anyway. Even if no one else remembers. There are angels that are roaming the earth looking for you specifically as you recite in your room. They do nothing but look for you. And they can do nothing but what Allah has ordered them to do. So there are angels that have been ordered to do nothing but roam the earth and look for you as you recite the Quran in your room. And when they come, they bring with them blessings that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has written, rahmah, mercy, protection, and the answering of dua, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about in the Quran or in the Hadith, and we can read all about the interaction of the angels in tafsir, because the angels are ordered, some of the angels are ordered to do nothing but pray for us. These women are women throughout history who have ensured that whether or not they had direct access to recitation, that they maintained its love for the next generation. Abdul Basit, there was a reciter in his time period. Her name was Madayar, and she was from South Africa. In 1962, she was going for a Hajj, and she was going on a ship, and every single city that they stopped at, on the port, people would come and say, "Where is the Hafidha on the boat?" When she reached Cairo, Abdul Basit invited her into his home, and he listened to her recitation and tested her. She would teach in the morning until the afternoon for women, and in the afternoon until the evening for men. We have the stories of those like Sheikha Nafisa, who said she spent 60 years memorizing and reviewing the Quran, and she knows it better than her name. We have Sheikha Sa'ad, radiyallahu anha, rahmatullah alayha. She just passed away in the 1990s. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala be pleased with her. And my teacher, Sheikh Muhibullah, may Allah bless Sheikh Muhibullah, and all of our teachers. And Sheikh Abdullah Deep was my other teacher, and all of our teachers, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala raise their ranks. Sheikh Muhib helped me see that obviously we know the Quran is for men and women, do we not? Obviously we know that. Of course the Quran is for men and women, of course. But Sheikh Muhib helped me see that the Quran shapes our narrative as women. It responds to our questions as women. It helps us see who we are as we navigate the world as women. And one time, Sheikh Muhib got so angry at me when I spoke about the Quran in spaces, particularly in a way that meant that maybe I didn't have as much access. And he pointed to Sheikh Sa'ad, because he used to keep an article in the classroom of her story. And he pointed to her and he said about her, "This is Sheikh Sa'ad. Men and women would travel from Palestine. May Allah give Philistine victory and liberate Philistine in our lifetimes and use us for it, Ya Rabbi, Allahumma Ameen." And from Saudi Arabia, and from Kuwait, and from all these different places, and they would come just to get her ijazah from her because she had the shortest sanad in the world and one of the qira'at, subhanAllah. This is our history of women, your foremothers, our great-great-great-grandmothers with Quran. And that legacy is one that, mashallah, we see all over the world today. And you see it here too, mashallah. You see the way that this conference is for Quran. What we especially see today are the women of Gaza. We see the women of Gaza, and they are in a tent, and they are teaching their children and the children of the neighbors. They've come together to make Quran schools in refugee tents. I saw a clip of a young child sitting with her mother, and she used to speak. She no longer can speak because of the trauma. She hasn't been able to speak a word. Her mother learned sign language. She is speaking in sign language with her and teaching her the Quran in sign language. We have women who are standing, and they are standing and they're staring at the camera. And as they're staring at the camera, they are reciting an ayah, talking about the shuhada, talking about their own fathers emulating this verse. People who live the Quran, because maybe you've also seen children, literally children, getting their heads stitched, a wound with no anesthesia. And the way that they are getting through it is by reciting the Quran. There's a difference between someone who says, yeah, I want to memorize the Quran, and someone who lives it. Of course, memorizing the Quran is amazing. We should all aim for that. But is it affecting our actions too? Is the recitation, is the memorization making us harsher, angry, frustrated? Or is it making us someone that people look at and they say, there's something about you that makes me remember Allah? And you don't need to have the whole Quran memorized for that yet. You can be that with one ayah. And then slowly you can get, inshallah, to the whole revelation, inshallah. But it's okay if it takes you 70 years. As long as you're on that journey for 70 years, inshallah. And imagine the honor of being able to say, I've spent 70 years memorizing the Quran. I've spent 70 years walking with the Quran, sitting with the Quran, with my throat hoarse because of the Quran. It took me 7 years to memorize the Quran. And the review is a lifetime. I am not Arab, so I'm not a native Arabic speaker. I learned Arabic later. I used the translation to help myself memorize the verses I didn't understand. I never met someone who said it took them 7 years before. I met people who said it took them 1, or it took them 2. And I felt like I am so behind. But I did it while I was doing a lot of things at once. I couldn't drop everything and just focus on memorization. And for me, knowing that it's okay that it takes time, as long as you're working slowly to understand it, to live it, to understand it and live it and memorize it and review it, that it's a lifetime goal, that your voice is recorded even when you are struggling. When Ustad Taymiyyah, Hafidahullah, said about Tajweed, you should have seen us. I was sitting next to Ustad Marjan, mashallah tabarakallah, Hafidah Marjan, and Hafidah Samia, mashallah tabarakallah, and she talked about, isn't it hard? And all three of us were like, oh, it's so hard. Because it doesn't matter if we've been doing this for 20 years. We still have mistakes. You saw me on stage. You all had to help me. It's a process. Sometimes I can do it in my room by myself. Here, it's a process. But I'm committed, inshallah. I pray I'm committed. I pray that Allah will accept the commitment. Why did I say that? I should have told you, if you're committed, Allah will accept your commitment, inshallah. But also, when it comes to women's voices, there is a question about recitation and menstruation. So I want to break down for you very quickly what the scholars have said if you are in menses and you want to recite. There are, like most issues in fiqh, scholars who differ on the evidences. There are some scholars, and it's the widespread opinion. The widespread opinion means the majority of the madahib follow that it is not permissible for a woman to recite at menstruation. This is the Hanafis, the Shafi'is, the Hanbalis. Now, this is the general position of the madhab, which means scholars within the madhab may hold a different position. Like some scholars may hold a different position than the general madhab. However, they say what you can do are verses that are dua. So for example, when you're sitting in the car. What do you say when you sit in the car? So that's a dua, but it's also a verse in the Quran. So because it's a verse in the Quran, if your intention is, I'm going to recite the Quran, the scholars of these madhahib say that's not permissible. But if your intention is you're going to make the car dua, the scholars of this position say it is permissible. Does that make sense? Then there's the other scholars of the other position. So the other position, there are a number of scholars, but the general, I'll just give you some names that maybe you've heard of. Bukhari, Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn al-Qayyim, Albani, Ibn Hazm, al-Tabari, and there are more. Those are probably some of the ones you're most familiar with. What are their evidences? So those who say that it's not permissible, there's no verse in the Quran that denotes anything related to this issue, so there's no verse. They base it on hadith. So the first and main evidence, which is a sound narration, is that Aisha radiallahu anha mentioned the Prophet ﷺ would recite the Quran in her lap and lay down in her lap when she was in menses. So scholars like Ibn Daqiq al-Eid, for example, the way that he explains this is, unless it was not normal for her to typically recite Quran, and she's explaining the situation as an exception to the rule, it doesn't make sense for her to have mentioned it in the first place. Does that make sense? So they're basing their understanding of it not being permissible on an inference that Aisha radiallahu anha would have not made that statement in the first place had it not been a big deal. Does that make sense? Number two, by the way, this is the speediest field class on this issue because it could easily actually be taught. So please feel free to study it in much more detail. I'm just giving you a summary. The second proof is that there are a number of different narrations that talk about a person who is in janaba and a woman who is in menses not reciting the Quran. These are hadith and they are statements of righteous people or varying companions. However, there is discrepancy on the authenticity of basically all of them. Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Hazm, both of them say there is no authentic narration that actually addresses it in this way. But scholars who form the majority say there are so many weaker narrations that together they form the ruling. Does that make sense? Okay, the third thing is qiyas. Qiyas means that scholars look at one circumstance and then they say, okay, if in this circumstance this is the rule, then in a similar circumstance this is the same rule. Does that make sense? So they say that if a person is in the state of janaba, which the only reason I'm not explaining is because of the age group here, so I see a lot of younger people, so please look it up if you are not sure what I mean. But janaba has rulings of no recitation according to the majority. So they say if a person is in janaba and you can't recite, it's major ritual impurity, which means you need to do what? Ghusl, which is the shower. So they say if major ritual impurity is recitation, is janaba when you can't recite, then a woman in menses is in a state of major ritual recitation and therefore she cannot recite. However, Imam al-Qarafi says that's not a fair comparison because you can just, one, you chose to get into that circumstance, and two, you can take a shower and get out. But for a woman, it's completely out of her control. It can last up to 15 days if you do not follow the Hanafi madhab. And what do you do for 15? Every single month, for half of the month, you're not going to recite the Quran. What if you're a Quran student? What if you're trying to teach your children? What if you're a Quran teacher? There's all these circumstances where that makes the Quran so difficult to access. And so, the scholars who are in the position, and these are the main evidences for the position that says it's not permissible. The scholars who say it is permissible, they base it on one, that the Prophet ﷺ would always recite the Quran, would encourage recitation of the Quran, and then the Quran said, فَقْرَأُوا مَا تَيَسَّرَ مِنْهُ. So recite what is easy for you. So that means it's a command to recite in general, and you would not go against a command unless you have explicit evidence otherwise. And because they say the evidence of the majority is not explicit enough, according to this opinion, the default is you recite at all times. Does that make sense? The second proof that they use is that Aisha radiallahu anha went for Hajj. And when she went for Hajj, what happened?
She got her period.
Yeah, she got her period and she was crying. And the Prophet ﷺ went to her and he was comforting her. And he never told, the only thing he mentioned is not to do tawaf. But he ﷺ said to do everything else. So the scholars of this position say, he didn't say don't recite the Quran. And Hajj, you're gonna recite Quran. You're in Hajj, of course you're gonna recite the Quran. So had it not been permissible, the Prophet ﷺ would have said that it's prohibited. Now side note, because a lot of women take this narration and think when you're in Hajj, you don't make a tawaf. So very quickly, I'm going to in 1 second tell you the ruling of what to do if you're in menses and Hajj. Basically, Ibn Taymiyyah has a ruling. He's not the Hanbali madhab. But his ruling in this circumstance, because in his time, there was a caravan who would go for Hajj altogether. You know, you're going from Syria, you're going from Lebanon, you're going from Yemen, you're going from all these places, you go with a Hajj caravan. It would take months to get there, and then you're there, you have a caravan, you go back. In his time period, the ruler would give money to ensure there were Hajj stations to meet the Hajjaj. So let's say there's a caravan here, they leave from Mecca, and then they get to here, there's a group here. They refill their water, they get food, they keep going, okay? Then they go here, another Hajj caravan. The state is paying for these caravans. In Ibn Taymiyyah's time, the state changed and withdrew that money. So these caravans went away. What happened? Now they have to go from Mecca for months and months on end to wherever they need to go. Bandits realize there's not going to be groups of people all over the place to protect them, which means what? They can raid the caravans. So they started coming and they were killing people and stealing all of their property. So women who used to stay in Mecca for a long time so that they can finish their period and then finish everything they need to do, no longer were able to do that without threatening their life or their property. And so Ibn Taymiyyah said, none of the scholars before me had this circumstance because people used to just stay until everyone was done and then they would go. So Ibn Taymiyyah's position is that if a woman goes for Hajj and she knows she's not going to finish while she is there, let's say you were going to last for 7 days, you're only in Mecca for 3 days, you're not going to finish. So what do? You actually go ahead and you make Hajj, or you make Umrah. Let me just say Umrah because Hajj is a little bit different with ruling. Let me just say Umrah because most of us have this circumstance in Umrah. So if you know you're going to go for Umrah, so what do? You make Umrah exactly the same. But you don't pray the 2 rak'ahs after the tawaf. I got a message from a sister in Mecca like 2 weeks ago, and subhanAllah, I've been so overwhelmed, I don't check my Instagram messages like almost never now. I just happened to open Instagram and see this message. She said, I'm in Mecca, I was in Ihram, I got my period, I know I'm no longer allowed to make Umrah, so I got out of Ihram, and I'm wondering, can I just make dua close to the masjid? La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. This made me so angry. You're not out of Ihram, you're in Ihram. Who taught her and all of us that we don't know what to do? So the point is, Ibn Taymiyyah, he says to just make Umrah as if you would just make Umrah, just don't do the 2 rak'ahs of the Salah after the Tawaf. However, this is Ibn Taymiyyah's opinion. He also says there's no sacrifice to give. The Hanafis have the same opinion, but the Hanafis say you need to give a sacrifice because making Tawaf is not permissible when you're on your period, and therefore you give a sacrifice to make up for having made Tawaf. Now, if you're going to be in Mecca and you're going to finish, just wait and finish, and then make Umrah. These are for circumstances which you wouldn't. The reason I wanted to tell you that is because when I explained this hadith, I actually had someone say that they're going from Mecca to Mecca and they had attended a lecture where I mentioned it and they know they don't need to make Tawaf when they're in their menses, and I don't want that confusion here. So please, if you're going, inshallah, seek clarification advice from a sheikha or a sheikh before you go, inshallah. But just so there's no one in Mecca who messages me and says, I heard from your lecture not to make tawaf. So that's Ibn Taymiyyah's position. Now back to the recitation issue. This position is that the Prophet ﷺ didn't tell Aisha radiallahu anha not to recite Quran. Therefore, it's permissible to recite Quran. Does that difference make sense? Yes? Okay. That is for recitation. That's different from touching the Mus'haf. Touching the Mus'haf, the difference of opinion on that issue is derived from an ayah of the Quran and the same hadith of Aisha and Hajj. But that's not a topic we're covering right now. I just wanted to let you know how scholars look at one piece of evidence and then they have so many different understandings. So when we look at women's voices in Quran, we see women who don't recite while they're on their period. For centuries, we've had women who don't recite because they follow the majority of the madhahib's opinion. And inshallah, they are rewarded for every second they don't recite. And even if the angels are not commanded to look for women who don't recite, typically they would be reciting if they could. So Ibn al-Qayyim mentions the Prophet ﷺ talks about a person who is sick or traveling, and when they are sick or they are traveling, the rewards of what they used to do continue. And so, inshallah, you still get the reward. If you typically recite and then you stop for 10 to 15 days, inshallah, you're still being rewarded. Because the only reason you're doing it is out of your love for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Whether you follow this opinion or that opinion, you're doing it for the sake of Allah. You are doing it to get closer to the Quran. Sometimes keeping ourselves away from worship is a test because we want to be there, we want to be doing it. And sometimes in that test is a form of tazkiyah, a form of purification that brings us closer to Allah in a different way. So for those who follow that opinion, may Allah raise your ranks. And for those who don't, and who use that time to continue to recite, may Allah raise your ranks. Our history is filled with women of the Quran. Khadija radiallahu anha, when the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam received revelation, recite with me, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم, بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق. اقرأ وربك الأكرم. علم الإنسان ما لم يعلم. He ran to Khadija radiallahu anha, so scared. Khadija radiallahu anha is the one who affirmed this revelation. This revelation is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Khadija radiallahu anha is the first person, a woman, who believed in the Quran. Hafsa radiallahu anha, the daughter of Umar radiallahu anha, the first person who was not the Khalifa to have the physical copy of the Mus'haf in trust. This is an ummah of women of Quran. And you all, inshallah, all of you, inshallah, if you make the intention, oh Allah, I don't know what it means exactly, or I have these goals, you are counted as women of the Quran too. Because even if you are unable to fulfill those goals, but you make the intention and you want to do it, Allah will write it for you, as if you did. Because He loves you that much. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the end of Surah Hajj, a part of the end of Surah Hajj, it's هُوَ جَتَبَاكُمْ, that He has chosen you. Allah has chosen you right now to be right here in this time period for a reason. Like the woman of the Qariya app from all over the world, born Muslims and converts, typically abled and disabled. The Quran is for every single one of us, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when He revealed it, ensured that women of all different realities were included in that revelation.